Hi, I'm Gabriel Deverens from the Walkable Ottawa podcast. We are a homegrown initiative focused on transitioning Ottawa's neighborhoods into more walkable communities. We interview key stakeholders, industry leaders, and community members to see how we can build a better Ottawa of tomorrow. On today's episode, we have Robb Barnes, the Executive Director from Ecology Ottawa, which is a non-for-profit organization focusing on climate change, as well as building better, sustainable communities in Ottawa. We chat about their 15-minute action plan, as well as their collaboration with the City of Ottawa in regards to the new official plan. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm really excited to have Robb Barnes, the Executive Director from Ecology Ottawa. Robb, how are you today?
Great, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's in the spirit of all of the collaborative work that we've done through Walkable Ottawa. I'm really excited to kind of get your perspective on things in terms of what the this important transition that Ottawa is going through. So maybe we can start by maybe just you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. Are you from Ottawa? What's your background? How long have you been with Ecology Ottawa?
Yeah, so I grew up in Ottawa, born and raised West End, what we used to call the West End. I don't know if we still call it the West End, but it was around Pinecrest Road near Bayshore. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I grew up in the city. I remember growing up, I kind of just wanted to leave as quickly as I could. I found, Ottawa had that reputation of being kind of boring. And as I got into my teen years and early 20s, I said, well, we've got to go to a more exciting city. So I left Ottawa for a while and lived in Montreal for a little bit and then Toronto, but found myself drawn back to the city. It kind of stays with you, the city. There's a lot to love about it, despite the reputation. And I know that the reputation is one thing, and then the reality is another too, about how dynamic and exciting the city is. And so no, I'm a proud Ottawan. I've been back in the city for years and years now. And actually, when I came back, I got a master's degree at U of O, and then I started working in a consulting firm for a bit, but then found my way into the environmental NGO sector. So I've been with Ecology Ottawa as a volunteer or staff member since 2013. Mm-hmm. So a good 7 years now, and the organization has been around for about 13 years. Okay. So I've seen it now through most of its life, most of its growth, I guess. And so, yeah, I became the executive director about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, really committed to an organization that wants to make Ottawa a greener city, and so it's not only an environmental focus, that's kind of my primary aim, but the organization is really also about making Ottawa a better place to call home. So it's mm-hmm. pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. I've had a similar experience with kind of having that, kind of boring old town of Ottawa, like going through high school and figuring out where you wanted to go to school. And I went to Montreal too myself, so I had that experience of living right downtown in the plateau in a very dynamic, walkable environment, and found myself drawn to Ottawa too. And by having the privilege of traveling too, especially all over Canada and all of the, good part all over the world, Ottawa is a beautiful place to live. Like we're so blessed with the access of green space, the architecture, in this traditional little big town. And I think over the last few years, I think for a variety of different issues, there's been a big movement to Ottawa with a kind of younger demographic because of affordability and jobs, and kind of reinvigorating the boring Ottawa government town into a more dynamic metropolitan area. So, through Ecology Ottawa, like what are your role? What's the responsibilities of the organization? What's your objective? How many, how much of a membership do you have? How many people form part of Ecology Ottawa or are involved with the organization?
Yeah, so Ecology Ottawa, we say that we want to make Ottawa the green capital of Canada. That's lowercase g, so we're a nonpartisan organization. And what it, in terms of what we do, we're volunteer driven, we're an advocacy organization, and we're really focused on the city level, mm-hmm. Which is somewhat unique in the world of environmental NGOs. A lot of them are kind of looking at big national or international policy. But we're really looking at the city of Ottawa as the primary frame. We talk to all jurisdictions, all levels of government that influence the city. But primarily, the policy rhythm is set by council and the mayor. And so a lot of our focus is on City Hall there. We divide our work into 3 areas. We call them active city, renewable city, and living city. Active city is really about sustainable transportation, and to a large extent also about planning dimension. In terms of, are we designing our communities to make them more walkable, to make them more bike friendly, to allow for transit at a good scale. Renewable city is about climate change and the energy transition. So monitoring, city plans like energy evolution, commenting on, provincial energy policy and climate policy, etc. And then finally, living city is about, for a lot of us, the stuff that makes Ottawa such an amazing city, the kind of the living city that we kind of interact with on a daily basis. So trees, water, green space, biodiversity, green infrastructure, the kind of natural setting in which Ottawa is situated. And so collectively, those are the 3 areas that we work on. But I would say that a climate frame or, focus on climate change kind of permeates all 3 levels, even though, nominally it's under one of those cities, renewable city. And at the end of the day, you could think about, living or active city and renewable city as being kind of climate mitigation, and then living city being climate adaptation. How do we deal with climate change as it's baked in, and how do we make our city still livable and vibrant despite climate impacts?
Yeah. How do you think Ottawa's doing?
I'd say it's, as with all advocacy groups, I mean, we can always do better. I would say that's one easy answer. But the answer is complex, and it depends on the issue, right? Like on the climate front, I'd say that it looks like we're ahead in terms of our modeling.
Okay.
We've started getting a pretty fine-grained understanding of what needs to happen in the city, which is exciting. And there I'm referring to Energy Evolution, which is the city's climate renewable energy strategy, which just basically passed earlier today, actually, at council. So that's interesting. And, even a city like Toronto, which I think is usually a few steps ahead of us in terms of climate action, they don't have the level of understanding in terms of what's required financially for climate action to happen. And so we're a little bit ahead there. And part of what I'm basing this on is comparison with other cities across Ontario. Because usually we kind of, compare within the class and within, we're in touch with a lot of orgs across the province. It's harder to say where we sit relative to other cities like Vancouver. Vancouver is often touted as a big leader on the climate front and just in a lot of different areas. Although, I would say in our defense, we're very different cities, right? When I'm speaking about Vancouver, I'm talking about 600,000 people living in the downtown core of what we think of as Vancouver. They never amalgamated. So it's this, tiny little fraction of the most urban, element of the city. Ottawa's got rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas, so it's a bigger mix. And like a lot of Ontario municipalities, there's this kind of give and take with the different voices at council, right? Mm-hmm. Rural councillors usually want different things from urban councillors, and who want different things from suburban. So there's this kind of art of compromise that needs to take place at the political level. That we see, which isn't uncommon in Ontario. So yeah, I'd say it's a mixed bag. We're ahead on some things, but all this I would situate in the frame of with climate action. I think it was David Attenborough who said, you can't be radical enough at a certain stage, and I think we're there. We can't be radical enough, so Ottawa's got a lot further to go if we want to hit our climate targets. We're excited to see the city moving there. But there's a tremendous amount of work ahead over the next 30 years to get to net zero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess now we're at a pretty pivotal cross point in Ottawa's history, because we have the new official plan, which is a document that gets revised every 10, 15 years or so, where we make important policy decisions on how we want to use land within the municipality of Ottawa, right? And I find it's a very interesting exercise to go through it at this timing, with everything going on, and why we're doing this on Zoom, with the pandemic, because residents of Ottawa have never spent so much time at home and within their communities. And it seems like there's been a lot of buzz in the last, few months, but even probably a couple of years, around 15-minute neighborhoods. And now that we're going through the exercise of kind of drafting a new official plan, which will really dictate how we use the specific properties, how we develop them. What kind of key things are you looking for to come out through the official plan?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we're, I guess, expecting a lot from the official plan, and I would frame it under the lens of, this is what we've been saying, along with a collection of groups that are calling ourselves the People's Official Plan. And what we're saying is that we want the official plan to be Ottawa's climate emergency plan, in the sense that it needs to speak to that urgent need. And it can, and we think it should, because the kind of the window of time that it covers is more or less the time in which we need to move, towards net zero. It's, the UN, I think, tells us we have about 10 years left to really turn the corner and stay within a climate safe world. And so really action at this time is more important than ever. And we hope and expect to see that reflected in the official plan. In terms of what it means in practice, that's where it gets complicated. But I'd say that the walkability aspect and the move towards 15-minute neighborhoods and the tangible kind of policy elements that would help us get there are what we're really hoping to see. And we understand that the official plan is kind of a high-level document, and since it's like broad policy guidelines, but still, as much as possible, we'd like to see a kind of a commitment and a level of ambition towards tangible policy actions that get us towards 15-minute neighborhoods. So we've got a bunch of suggestions, we've got a bunch of policy asks around a vision for 15-minute neighborhoods. We'd cluster them under three kind of broad categories. We want to see more density in Ottawa, we want to see more mixed-use development, and we want to see less car dependency. Those three things, I think, if there's a clear theme that we're expecting and hoping to come out of the official plan, it's those three.
Yeah, it's interesting because now the city of Ottawa is projecting to have an extra 400,000 people come over the next 20 years in Ottawa. So there's been a lot of conversation, especially lately, around, where do we build housing? And I think if you're like, I had a few months ago, a friend from Montreal come and visit me, and just kind of looking at the city from a fresh perspective, who hadn't spent much time in Ottawa, said that, wow, the city's really scattered. There's a lot of single family homes. Where's those kind of walk up neighborhoods? And I think and in terms of creating some of that housing, from my perspective, the way I see it is I guess you have to start from the core. You have to start kind of regentrifying some of the urban neighborhoods, because I live in Overbrook. And even though it's central and maybe a couple kilometers from Parliament Hill, there's not much in terms of walkability to small local commercial shops. And from some of the public consultations that we've done through our initiative through Walkable Ottawa, that's one of the big points in terms of transitioning certain, kind of streets that might have had a commercial shop at one point in time, to increase a bit more destinations, because I guess truly a walkable neighborhood is walkable if you're within 750 meters from all of your amenities. And realistically in Ottawa, there's not many places that provide that kind of lifestyle. And now, just given the kind of the market, the real estate market, the way it's been, looking at the price of a single family home, looking at the price of anything within the urban core or what would be traditionally a walkable neighborhood, they're quite expensive and not really accessible for most people.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I'm so excited that Walkable Ottawa is kind of, leading parts of that conversation, because I think thinking about the real estate market and how that interacts with policy is such a critical lens, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about what we'd like to see the city do, but we understand that there are, a million plus private actors interacting with all these policies, right? So it's not like we can decree by fiat that we're going to have the most amazing city and then have it happen. So there's a bunch of kind of, incentive structures that we need to put in place. And as you say, I think it's a really good point. It's not, there's so many neighborhoods that have been built, and the one that I grew up in is a prime example where they're not walkable, you can't get places very easily because it just wasn't built into the fabric at the time. And so kind of retrofitting and thinking about how we do that well, and then get it with community support becomes a kind of a very complex question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do you find the collaboration between kind of major stakeholders? So I guess in one side we have the private sector, so that the housing, the builders, and all of the, you know, supporting industries. We have the City of Ottawa themselves, and then we have other kind of, you know, organizations like Walkable Ottawa and Ecology Ottawa, as well as just, you know, the residents of Ottawa. How do you find that collaboration has been over the last, you know, few months leading up to the new official plan from the City of Ottawa?
I think, you know, to a certain extent, I think the challenge with any of these things is that because it's a big, hairy, kind of complex policy question, and the city is as complex as it is, there's an element of siloing that we see. And I think, you know, groups like Walkable Ottawa are great because they're really there to try to bridge some of those divides. One concern I think we always have, and you see this reflected at any level of government, is if the city is consulting with nonprofits, does it treat what's the way in which it treats nonprofit actors? Are they just one voice of many, or does it consider how many stakeholders are interacting with that nonprofit? And so there's some people, some Ecology Ottawa supporters who, you know, support groups like Ecology Ottawa and many other groups throughout the city. And then sometimes feel like they're being disregarded, you know, because sometimes NGOs are kind of listened to in a box. There's the sense that a box is checked at the city that, okay, great, we listen to the nonprofits, now let's listen to the businesses, and we're going to find a nice compromise in between those two. Right. And so I understand for the city, you know, it's always a tricky balancing act. But I would say that you know, I think there's been siloing, and I think the exciting thing with Walkable Ottawa and with the way the conversation's going lately is that we're trying to find these solutions that kind of speak to all sides. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're entering an exciting kind of time, and I hope it's reflected in some of the language around the official plan and other master plans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think like this is our third episode of the podcast, and we've had Rosalind Hill, who's a local architect and a development consultant, who's really the founding member of Walkable Ottawa, as well as the executive director of the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association. And speaking to Rosalind and figuring out her experience in terms of what she sees in her line of work, and sees the, I guess, frustrations in terms of the housing supply that is being built within the city, or what makes most business sense to build, and the fact that it doesn't really meet the housing demand from the general population. You know, like you think of semi-detached, well, you know, they get built, and they sell for 800,000, 900,000, $1 million, $1.1 million. They don't really meet the market demand of everyday kind of normal, you know, everyday people, right? And talking to, you know, the Jason Berggraf, the executive director of GOLBA, it kind of seems like a lot of people want the same things, you know. From my research, I did not know how big an impact can intensifying your existing city make for the environment. And the way Rosalind put it was that it's the single biggest decision we can make, you know, because if you think of one property and then it gets redeveloped and you have 3, 4, 5, 6 dwellings on it, you know, those, if they're already established within the infrastructure of the city, then people can, you know, go down from, you know, 2 cars to 1 car, or from 1 car to no car, or from, you know, and then bicycle and walkability. And one of the you know, there's been a few on different seminars, different organizations, there's been the analogy of an airplane and how walkability, which really depends on different facets of the airplane, and you need all the pieces of the airplane to work in order to actually achieve the walkability. And we need the bar to be set quite high if we're going to stir ourselves away from a car-dependent kind of society. So, yeah, I think from a zoning standpoint, I guess I'm just going through, and I'll attach it later on, but you guys produce a action plan for 15-minute walkable neighborhoods. You maybe want to touch a little bit on that and kind of some of the findings that you've done through your research and what you're hoping to accomplish.
Sure, yeah, and maybe just to build too off the point that you just made, Gabriel. I think it's so true that how we build is the most fundamental, or one of the most fundamental considerations from a climate perspective, and it's not super well known within climate circles even.
Yeah.
That, if people ask, what can a city do? Well, cities have massive control over land use, and that is where so much in terms of the import of decisions from a climate perspective gets made. And here I would reference Dr. Diane Sachs, who's the former Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. She, as I said, former, so her position was terminated by the provincial government, but before she left, there was a final report on energy efficiency, and she was looking at the provincial level because that's obviously the lens and her mandate. And she identified 3 major actions that the province could take on climate action. And the first one was carbon pricing, and we always hear about that in the news. Carbon tax is well regarded by economists as a way to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Whether it's politically saleable is always the issue of debate, but I think people acknowledge that it's a powerful tool. Number 2, though, was land use, and in her language, it was stopping sprawl and enhancing intensification. And so that's where and number 3 was actually protecting nature, and those 2 things go together, right? If we intensify more, we can protect nature. So we're really advocating. So to kind of follow then is, what about this action plan for 50-minute neighborhoods? We're really kind of zeroing in on the importance of density. And we understand that density is not like a switch that you flick. You get density and all of a sudden, bells go off and everything's great. We understand that there are concerns around density. Not all neighborhoods want to intensify quickly, but from a climate lens, the logic is pretty simple in the sense that the denser you get in general, the better you're doing. There's a strong inverse correlation between the density of a city and its greenhouse gas emissions. So the denser you get, the lower your greenhouse gas emissions per capita. Barcelona, it'll take us a long time to get to the level of greenhouse gas efficiency of like a Barcelona. Yeah. And many more measures than Barcelona needs to take to get to net zero, because they've already got the built form. And another quick kind of example is, purely by virtue of waking up every morning where they do, the average Manhattanite has a lower carbon footprint than anyone else in the United States, purely by virtue of where they live, because Manhattan is a very dense, walkable community. Does it follow that we want to turn Ottawa into Manhattan tomorrow? No. So that's a non-starter, and that's fine. Right. But can we do density right and build these kind of livable, walkable neighborhoods? I think the answer is yes. And I think, Walkable Ottawa has some really interesting studies in terms of what that would look like in neighborhoods like Overbrook. Right. A lot of our kind of these neighborhoods that are fairly close to the core, but were built on a different model. I'm in Old Ottawa East, so not too far from Overbrook, and it's the same here. We could do a lot more in terms of density here to make it a much more walkable neighborhood. But that's it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, why do you think that the increased density within the existing city is such a little known fact within the environment community and even the greater population as a whole? Because most of the time I feel like people want like when it comes to the density, but there's a lot of resistance there. And I guess it's maybe partly fear of change or maybe bad experiences of development in the neighborhood. But why do you think that is?
Yeah, I would say it goes back to the kind of history of environmentalism. If you think about the history of environmentalism, in the 1800s and the 1900s, I think about figures like, even like Teddy Roosevelt, right? Like and Roosevelt was a big environmental advocate in the context of US history, but his version of environmentalism is preserving wild spaces. And of course, that's tremendously important. But I think, early in that conception of environmentalism, there was the idea that, the environment is a place where people aren't. And it was kind of not anti-human, so you want to balance those two things, but Roosevelt's probably dream was, to have a vast tract of land where he could go and hunt things and then come back into the city and do it and work his job. And I think that old model of environmentalism has stayed with us to a certain extent. People think of environmentalists, with the ism attached to it. It's like, well, it's people in Clayoquot Sound, tying themselves to trees and like trying to make sure that development doesn't happen. And I think a much more modern and probably I would argue sophisticated version of environmentalism is understanding that development does happen, and it's something that we need to be involved in order to do it well. And that cities are, in fact, quite astounding in terms of the efficiencies they provide. Cities are a very old human invention, and they concentrate jobs and housing in one place. And there's so much to work with there from an environmental perspective. I think getting cities right and learning how to build a greener city should be a fundamental concern to environmentalists, especially as the world urbanizes and Canada urbanizes. So groups like Ecology Ottawa are trying to think about how we build a greener city, because we don't think we can take cities out of the equation. We understand that nature-based climate solutions and land preservation and conservation are super important, but also important is dealing with emissions where 80% of Canadians live, which is cities.
Mm-hmm. And I guess within that kind of spirit, in terms of increasing the density, part of it is making the communities more vibrant, right? So making the communities a more desirable destination. There's more parks and recreation, there's more community centers, there's more local small commercial shops. How do we make our city more vibrant?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Gabriel. I mean, yeah, I think the coolest thing with this direction is that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can get lower greenhouse gas emissions and you can make a much more exciting, vibrant city. The reason I left Ottawa when I did was because it wasn't a particularly vibrant city from where I was sitting, which is, why first thing I did when I was 16 is you get your license because you need to drive around, right? Because you live in like, a 1950s suburb and, your cats all get hit by cars and like, it's, again, not to denigrate the neighborhood that I grew up in. I think it's great, but there are elements that were not walkable and they affect quality of life. So what do we want to see? So again, I don't think density is necessarily a silver bullet. It needs to come, as I think the plane analogy was so appropriate. It's like, you can't just get a bunch of wings and then you're flying. It's like, there's an engine and there's seating on the plane and there's protection from the elements. So density has to be paired with certain things. And I think that the mixed use piece is super, super important. And another way of understanding mixed use development for us is more vibrant communities. So how do we get more vibrant communities? We would expand, ask for the expansion of mixed use zones, update zoning policies to integrate things like grocery stores, schools, local retail, corner stores, all these things that we used to have. It's funny, it's in some ways it's a very retro campaign because we're trying to reclaim what we used to build into cities, and that because of our economic models and because of a large number of reasons have kind of faded away. But the move towards local, which I think is this ties into nicely, local business, local revenue streams. I think that pairs really well with the move towards 15-minute neighborhoods. And then, while we're at it, I think, we can increase our, tree canopy target, but also stop bad developments. There are certain types of developments that I think kind of degrade and diminish a city. And there I'm thinking, the kind of conventional big box and strip mall developments. Can we think of doing those another way or modifying kind of the business as usual approach? Because what you end up doing when you create these things is creating this legacy that lasts decades, right? This kind of car dependency. And so, yeah, it is a multi-pronged challenge. I guess I should add that the going after car dependency and allowing for more mobility choice is another important aspect, right? If we start being very intentional about giving people more options rather than just the car. When I was 16, if someone said, hey, you don't have to drive to get to your friend's house. You can take, a bus that'll actually show up on time,
Hmm.
and that doesn't cost, an arm and a leg. I would have taken it, right? I think a lot of people want those other choices. They're just limited and constrained because of the way we've built so far.
Hmm. It's funny the way Ottawa is built. So you have, let's say, everything that was built before the Second World War. So the Glebe, Old Ottawa South, Old Ottawa East, where you are, even parts of Overbrook and Vanier and Hintonburg, and all of those neighborhoods, the way they were built at the time, were quite very walkable, right? There was wasn't many cars, nearly as many cars as we have now back then, but you were only a couple blocks within everything that you needed. And I think that's how those communities, which are all very diverse and all have their different identity and lifestyle, but kind of develop their personality over time. And then you look after the Second World War, where you have what they call this kind of suburb of that era, that kind of bungalow belt around the core of those neighborhoods, this kind of green belt development, but that's not within the green belt. That would have been outside of outlying areas at that time. And one of the things that I see on your paper in terms of increasing density is eliminating the R1 zones. Now that's I think a big challenge, I think overall, to kind of get the city to buy in. But can you maybe provide a bit of perspective in terms of why you would like to increase the densities in those areas?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And because we're talking on via computer, I'm trying to get the quote that I was thinking of when you were saying that. I think it was Galileo. I forget who it was. It probably wasn't. It's probably misattributed to him. But there's a saying, something like, if you shoot for the stars, you might get halfway and land on the moon. Yeah, and I think that's it with the R1 zoning. We understand that the request to eliminate R1 zoning will strike many policymakers at the city as like completely radical and totally infeasible.
Yeah.
So we're proceeding with that understanding, but we're encouraged because we're seeing examples from other jurisdictions. Just crossed my desk this morning, Minneapolis did a version of that. Edmonton is doing some ambitious upzoning. And so more generally, the idea is to get the city to think, okay, maybe we don't eliminate R1 zoning, but maybe we increase the density of those neighborhoods. But to be fairly ambitious and fairly radical in terms of its proposals to take ambitious action on climate change and try to connect those dots between the types of housing that we're building and the emissions that flow from that type of development. So I think there's a real question that can and should be asked in a world in which we're facing a climate emergency and every minute counts. Do we have, and in a world in which food security is going to be an increasingly meaningful issue in the coming years, can we really afford more farmland to be chewed up for more sprawl? And I think that's the question we all need to ask ourselves. And I think the city hasn't gotten there yet. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, and say, well, we can sprawl a bit, and we're gonna go after some farmland, but not prime farmland. And I don't think the majority of Ottawans are comfortable with that kind of that answer. I know in a lot of European jurisdictions, they are building denser, even in new suburban development. So I think that there's an opportunity there so that we don't repeat the past, right? We don't have these new neighborhoods that are completely cut off from amenities. Instead, we're building in that walkability from ground zero. And I think the result will be, there will be many benefits to come from it, including, cheaper transit, healthier populations. There's some kind of intangibles about, like, is your community an exciting place to call home? But I think we can do it. And I think something like eliminating R1 zoning is a good place to start in terms of the thinking behind ambitious upzoning policy.
Yeah, and I think a big part of terms, just to kind of tie that loop, a big part about walkability neighborhoods is accessibility, right? So, and I think now in Ottawa, we have an LRT system that will basically connect all ends of the city, in the next 5-7 years as they're building out phase 2 and phase 3 of the project. But so it kind of ties in the whole city as a whole, right? And I know that transportation plays a really big role in terms of achieving that walkability and meeting some of the environmental targets. What, from a transportation perspective, what are the things that you're hoping to see change for the better in Ottawa?
Yeah, there once again, I think we're shooting for the stars or the moon. In terms of some of these asks, we know will sound ambitious to city officials, but one is let's have an adult conversation around congestion pricing. Economists tell us that just like a carbon tax, it's like if you don't price something and people use it for free, they'll use more than what they need, and it's less efficient for society as a whole. And then there's a bigger question about, the city always complains about a lack of revenue. It's like, well, let's start taxing the things we don't want more of, which is traffic. No one wants more traffic on our roads. And a congestion pricing strategy would be a partial solution to getting there. We also think that the city needs to stop basically subsidizing fossil fuels. And here I would, this might sound counterintuitive again in the environmental movement, we always talk about stopping fossil fuel subsidies, and on polls, everyone says, I don't want to subsidize fossil fuels. In an urban context, we subsidize fossil fuels all the time by building new roads. We're always expanding and extending our road network. And it's not to say that in all cases we shouldn't, but it is to say that we should take a close look and understand the implications of building more road infrastructure for phenomena like induced demand, which is to say, if you build more roads to drive on, there's a very well studied phenomenon that more people drive on them, right? So people respond to those incentives. So let's be more critical in terms of our spending and not just widen large suburban arterials at a cost of $110 million, which is the case with Strandhurst Drive right now in Barrhaven. We can not make that mistake. And so, those are kind of two of the big asks, and we understand that each budget is a test. So there's one thing about the official plan and the transportation master plan and all these big kind of policy directions, and those are really important to look at. And then another is kind of, we understand money talks, and each budget is a test of council's commitment towards some of these principles. And so we want to see council pare down its road expansion budget and use that money for other purposes, like, for example, active transportation, put it into transit, etc.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very encouraging to see things all happen all at once within the city of Ottawa's perspective, because the new official plan is the overwhelming, overarching document. And like you said, there's a few complementary studies. So the zoning bylaw reform, the transportation master plan. What would you describe as low-hanging fruit, or very simple things that would have a very big impact that are very easy for everybody to get on board? Because sometimes I find it hard, like when we talk about 20, 30-year objectives, it might seem like an insurmountable task, but sometimes, we lose sight of some of the things that are achievable right now that we can maybe build some momentum off of.
Yeah, one quick and easy one. Well, maybe there are two that come to mind. But yeah, one of them that is maybe a little bit on the ambitious side, but again is copying best practices from Edmonton. Mm-hmm. Edmonton's just been knocking it out of the park lately. It's always kind of making the news or doing these things, and that is to eliminate mandatory minimum parking requirements. Okay. It's a thing that people usually don't think about. But if you look at, now that we all have Google Maps at our disposal, we can look at any development, and you can, especially the older ones, these older kind of box mall complexes, but even little offices situated here and there. And I would say that in general, you can see that the land area that the building occupies is usually more or less, there's a 1-to-1 ratio between the land area for the building and then the land area for the parking associated with it. Yeah. And the question is, do you really need that much parking? And I think the answer is often no, but even if a developer didn't want to build that much parking, they're required to by bylaws, by certain bylaws, saying, well, this is zoned as X, and therefore, within that context, you need to build, X number, Y number of parking spaces. Right. And thinking at scale, if we eliminated that requirement and said, let's do it, in accordance with demand, the developer will understand the demand for traffic and then build in that, and that'll be factored into the price of the final sale. if we proceed on that front, I think what we'd end up seeing is a lot of, unnecessary parking removed, and then you could use that space for other purposes. And again, it would make it a more dense, walkable, exciting city.
Yeah.
But that's, it would take a few years to start seeing a real impact there. I would say probably the easiest thing on the list is for the city to just follow through on its complete streets policy. This is a policy that's already adopted, I think, unanimously. And this is to say that every time a road goes up for development, the city's going to look at incorporating multiple modes of transportation on that street when it rebuilds it, which is great. The only challenge is in consistency and implementation, because sometimes you end up seeing sometimes if it's a sidewalk in a residential area, some residents don't want to see that sidewalk because it would take away from what they thought of as their properties, even though it's technically under the ownership of the city. Sometimes also we see kind of projects that are watered down, and you're seeing unsafe kind of bike lanes that are just painted lines and sharrows. We can do better, and it really doesn't need to cost that much money at all. And so I would think that those would be two kind of easy solutions to make a lot of progress here.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's sometimes I find residents maybe lose sight of the impacts of some of those small marginal decisions that they can make that really affect the community. But I think one of the things that you said at the beginning of the podcast is how most of these big decisions, like you think about climate change and the whole planet as a whole, but most of these decisions actually happen at the municipal level of government and not provincial or federal in terms of how we use some of the landmass, right? And I find that it's encouraging now to see the amount of awareness and the amount of engagement and how top of mind it is now. And I'm hopeful that we can kind of continue to build momentum over, the years to come, and have Ottawa really be a leader in Canada, like you speak of Edmonton and some of the other examples that you've illustrated throughout this call.
Yeah, I think, to our earlier conversation, I think there's a spirit in Ottawa, and I think it's, people like us who maybe came back to the city and said, this can be a really amazing place to call home. Of course, it is already for many of us, but exciting and kind of a leader in a lot of respects. The bones of the city are just phenomenal, right? You've got this beautiful river, you've got the, Gatineau Hills are not in the city, but, adjacent to the city, the canal, the Rideau River, you've got this beautiful kind of setting. Mm-hmm. And I will say also the fact that we have winter is an asset for sure. When I lived in Toronto, I missed the Ottawa winters and I missed skating on the canal. There's a lot to work with here, and I think a little ambition in the context of a capital city that ends up having probably a disproportionate amount of dollars for things like this goes a long way. We can very quickly make Ottawa a really stunning example, I think, of how to do urbanism well and how to tackle climate change at the same time.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who wants to get involved on a local level?
Yeah, usually I say the first thing I would recommend is often to get involved with your community association or groups like Ecology Ottawa. We're a volunteer-driven organization, so we work with hundreds of volunteers each year, and we've got people doing research and people knocking on doors when COVID allows, of course, phoning, holding events. So get involved at the local level. There are lots of groups: Green Space Alliance, Ecology Ottawa, Just Food. There are others outside of the narrow environment space. There's all sorts of, but just in general, in terms of getting involved, join the community association. They're always looking for members. It's usually cheap. My membership with the Old Ottawa East Community Association is $3 a year, and you get plugged in that way. And there's nothing like a community association for giving you that kind of ground level view of what's happening. Mm-hmm. But of course, I wouldn't, lose sight of what's happening citywide either. So write your councillor, plug in, follow those issues, follow, I think with the way media is going, there's only a handful of journalists left to cover City Hall in Ottawa, but they're great journalists. John Willing, Joanne Chianello, Kate Porter, followed in the news because it's worth doing. If you think about the kind of modern challenge of how do I plug in and how do I make a difference in general. Often people think about something like climate change as a big international issue, and maybe it gets sorted out with a Paris Agreement. But the reality is the implementation happens a lot at the local level, and community involvement is really kind of like the engine that it runs on. And you'll see that, there's a tangible difference there. We do a lot of organizing at Ecology Ottawa in suburban communities, and there are patches of Canada and Orleans where there's a community association that's really active, and then right next to it there isn't much happening. And the difference is night and day in terms of the types of kind of projects that you're seeing coming to fruition, because there are people kind of getting involved and plugging in. So yeah, I would say get involved with your community association, write your counselor, follow the news, join local orgs like Ecology Ottawa.
Cool. Is there anything else we haven't touched on that you'd like to kind of speak out of on the last few minutes of the podcast?
I think we did a really comprehensive tour. So thanks so much for your time. I'd encourage people to visit ecologyottawa.ca. You can get involved. You can read about the 15-minute neighborhoods campaign. But we also do many other things, on trees, on green space protection, biodiversity. So I'm sure there's room for all types, all interests at Ecology Ottawa, and we're really trying to keep broadening the tent and keep building that conversation at the community level.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that the draft of the new official plan from the City of Ottawa is coming out in the next month or so. And I hope that we have another opportunity again to kind of collaborate, to kind of see what the City of Ottawa is proposing and go through that exchange and collaboration in terms of getting everybody on board in terms of on things that we can agree on and also disagree on. But I think, like you said, I think the objective is to really bring up awareness and engagement, and to really stress to people the amount of impact that this on a local level can really have on addressing some of the climate change issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, Christmas is coming early this year, Ottawa. So unwrap that official plan draft and send in your comments, because the city's going to need to hear from residents all across the city in terms of, does it meet our needs, and how can we tweak it and improve it? So yeah, super exciting opportunity. It's kind of a once in a generation opportunity too, right? The official plan doesn't get revised super often, so great opportunity to plug in and make your voice heard.
Thank you very much, Rob. And Christmas came early. We'll talk after Christmas.
Have a good one.
Thank you for joining us on the latest episode of the Walkable Ottawa podcast. If you want to keep up on our progress, make sure to follow us on social media at Walkable Ottawa, as well as visit our website for more information at walkableottawa.ca. If you don't want to miss the next episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Thank you.